This wee town in Otis isn't exactly the free wharf.
Well, I've definitely been in some rundown places, but this one's high on the list. Don't know if there's really a lot of coin here to earn, your lordship. Is there a reason we're here?
Lad, there's wealth to be had all over, if one values the truth. And you know, I don't need a reason to be anywhere. I'm always exactly where I should be.
Ha! Never out of place and never out of time.
Nay without song and nay without rhyme.
From town to town, singing a tale.
For food, for board, and a flagon of ale.
Bard and Vaxo, the travelling poets.
Recounting the past as only we know it.
Stories of war, of magic and spies.
Stories of nobles, of kingdoms and lies.
The city of Adwick, an imperial strife.
The Ledford survivors, clinging to life.
While spared from death, their fate was not done.
For once danger reached Adwick, where could they run?
Though the fear of death crept well through their bones,
the survivors endured among fractured thrones. Over 6 months had passed since the fall of Ledford, and the war in Ireland had only continued apace. King Aelus was dead, and in the summer of the year 8324, his son Gavus ascended the throne at the capital of Adwick. Adwick was the capital of Ireland, and though it was already the most populous city in the country, the war had sent refugees streaming out of the east and into the west. The once orderly comings and goings of merchants and peasant folk had gradually become a routine morning clamor of refugees at the gates seeking the protection of the walls. To that end, upon the outbreak of the war, gaining temporary residence within the city was no small feat, and it was often the case that families and peasants would pawn every scrap of wealth they had while fleeing west, just so they could secure lodging in the capital. In the rarest of cases, useful craftsmen and tradesmen could typically find work and lodging packed into a bunkhouse at the Laborers' Guild, but far more often many found themselves shoveled into the overcrowded poor quarter, a once humble district of town that had rapidly become a maze of ramshackle shanties and scrap construction where bodies huddled in squalor and filth on a daily basis. It was for this reason that coin had become more important than ever, and Ireland's already strained supplies were made even more evident due to Adwick's refugee crisis. Therefore, it was the business of the Guard to dispatch a small contingent of irregulars to the southern farms of Barley Roll to ensure that the supplies there remained secure and free from disruption, both from without and from within. Thankfully, through the efforts of the mercenaries, little blood was shed in the endeavor, even if violence had to be brought to bear by the irregulars upon the townsfolk there. Despite the supplies being temporarily secured, the war continued to press in ever further. As daily word reached Adwick of the imperial advance, the crown was pressed more and more into defensive measures. Reinforcements were dispatched from the capital to both Badaria Forest and the city of Ambershire. Even so, while it had become increasingly common in the course of the war for such reinforcement waves to be accompanied by contingents of mercenary men from companies such as the Iron Wolves or otherwise, rumors that emerged from Ambershire were uncommon even for the typical peasant gossip. The word was not only that the forces of Ireland had remarkably repelled the imperial siege, but that a so-called Lord of Gewin was among the defenders of the town. Gewin was, of course, a long-conquered kingdom that had since become an occupied imperial province over 2 decades prior. While many still knew the name of Gewin, the notion that anyone might claim nobility from such a forgotten state did more than raise an eyebrow or two. Still, these were largely matters of rumor, even if the rumors were said to reach the Empire, as well as Adwick. The weeks that followed Ambershire were only accompanied by more hardship inflicted upon the peasantry both in and around Adwick. While the war had predictably given rise to increased incursions along the road by typical brigands and highwaymen due to the lack of patrols, within the walls more than one criminal gang had used the opportunity of the war to increase their influence. Whether it was peddling illegal drugs or just shaking down the local tavern, the gangs of both the Black Serpents and the Brass Skulls had become well known amongst the city folk. The ranks of these gangs were bolstered even further by the growing number of disaffected refugees, who were readily recruited into their number, and public violence became ever more a common occurrence as fights spilled out into the streets between these two groups. With the fate of the country already long at stake, these criminal elements had finally become intolerable to the crown. The word was passed down to the guard. The gangs must be dealt with by any means necessary. It was therefore the day that would later be known as the purging of Adwic's Poor Quarter would come to pass, as despite the near totality of Adwic's guard taking part in the securing of the district from the criminal element that lay within, it was one guard captain and his men whose brutality upon the common folk rapidly escalated into a one-sided massacre on the part of the guard. Despite being instrumental in exterminating the Brass Skulls from the city, it would be the captain of this guard regiment who would go on to later be known with great infamy among the common folk. Where once the horned helm of this captain garnered him the nickname of the steadfast Bull of Adwic, from that day forward, he would be forever remembered as the one whose plated souls emerged from the Poor Quarter, stained with the blood of innocence. Cries for justice against Dario, the Butcher of Adwic, have echoed forth ever since. Thanks to matters being secured within Adwic, the Crown's attention turned to the already besieged town of Oakenbrook, which had held out for a time under heavy losses, but was now at a tipping point in the war. Unfortunately, with a number of Adwic's nobility effectively sitting out of the war, and the Crown's coffers already running too tight to enlist additional mercenaries into the fight, it was inevitable that a true conscription was undertaken to amass a peasant levy for the fight. Some went willingly, although far more found themselves pressed into service than would have liked. In the days that followed, a large contingent of barely trained militia were dispatched from the capital and towards the besieged Oakenbrook, and it would be there that the fate of Ireland would once again be decided. The assault on Oakenbrook lasted over 3 days of sporadic imperial advances, each time only narrowly repelled by the combined forces of the soldiers and levy. Rumors abounded quickly that the forces at Oakenbrook were additionally reinforced by smaller contingents deployed at critical moments in the siege. Some said these were disaffected refugees who had formed their own resistance cells in the wilderness. Yet others said that the Crown had quietly curried favor with tribes of wood elves who resented their homes around Badaria and Kagovia Forest being invaded. Regardless of the accuracy of such claims, however, the fact remained that thanks to the valor of mere peasants, the levies of Oakenbrook were able to hold the flanks long enough for the forces in the center to sally forth on the orders of the Arlandy Lord Commander Merrigan and end the siege with a final, decisive blow. Celebration was had, as it should have been, as Ireland turning back the Empire at these critical battles of Ambershire and Oakenbrook were historic to say the least. For the first time in as long as any could remember, the Empire had been driven back. While word that reached the capital stated that such hasty assaults that led to such defeats were merely the product of an overzealous Count of the Empire who had overextended his men, nonetheless, such victories bolstered Irelandic morale for a time, and for a time, it seemed as though Ireland stood a real chance in drawing the war into a stalemate. But at what cost? Levies that returned to Adwic told quite a different story. Villages and towns once occupied with honest rustic folk were now barren and listless. The heartblood of Ireland had been spent for these historic days, and the valor of peasants was valor that had been paid in blood. With ever fewer left to toil the fields and perform the necessary labor that kept Adwic alive, attention once again had to turn to Barley Roll Farm, which had been beset by orcs in the absence of a garrison. It would be here that nobility that had since been absent in the war would rise to the occasion, and although it was in small measure, an armed contingent organized by Lord Mildenhall and the young heiress Loretta Hartford would secure Barley Roll from further orcish incursion, much to the jubilation of the populace there, and back at Adwic. It would come to pass that during such timely measures, the crown reached the bottom of at least one of the problems plaguing Adwick from within. While little was known or said officially as it concerned the matter, word among the folk was that thanks to the efforts of a few mercenaries, sellswords, and house knights, agents of the crown were able to uncover a cult known as the Cradle of His Sorrow. A cult whose roots ran through nearly every part of Adwick, from the church to the castle itself. While precisely who was involved was never known, rumor tells that more than one corrupt crown official was quietly executed, and the rest of the matter thoroughly covered up by the newly appointed magistrate, Gerard Dorst. Adwick would change rapidly in the days that followed these events, and Ireland would finally withdraw the near totality of its troops from the east, setting the forest of Badaria ablaze during their retreat. As fear and unrest in the city only grew, the new magistrate would act swiftly to curtail any rebellion that might foment. Using his new authority, Dorst would reappoint one to the captaincy of the guard, whom he boldly and publicly claimed would command what a city like Adwick required: either fear or respect. Freshly returned from the smoldering ashes of Badaria, and thought to have died in his punishment among the penal battalion there, strode Dario, once the Butcher, but now rechristened as Knight Captain of the Adwick Guard. Dario's return was deeply resented by the common folk and much of the Guard itself. Yet even despite the open disdain shown by the commander of the Adwick forces, known as Leonard Osgood, it was undoubtable that Dario's return had the effect the magistrate desired, for none but the boldest of ruffians who remained within Adwick would dare cross the man who bore the reputation of the Butcher. But even still, there was one who remained. The boldest, most brazen, and most cunning and ruthless criminal who had plagued Adwick, Ireland, and Alzera itself for decades, and perhaps longer. The Viper. He was the leader of the gang known as the Black Serpents, and a man rumored to have had direct connections to the powerful Gradian underworld by way of the Dread Knife crime syndicate. Rumors further said that the Viper had influenced the drug trade within Adwick for quite some time, although exactly how long, no one knows. The man, or as he was thought to be a man, was further rumored to not be a human, but a drow, and one who had lived to be over a millennia old. Beyond just age, however, was his impeccable skill as an assassin and duelist. It would often be that old rogues deep enough into their cups would quietly express that the Viper, one whose true name had been lost to time, was likely the greatest living swordsman in the known world, surpassing even the deadliest of Imperial Inquisitors or the eldest Bjorning that trod somewhere upon a barren tundra. Such claims were always the product of fancy and fantasy, however, and it would always be that the lives hallmarked by the greatest violence were always matched by their great brevity. Were the Viper to match up to any of these claims, either they were wildly exaggerated, or he should have already been dead. Regardless of the rumors, however, it would come to pass that the Viper would make his presence known within Adwick. In a chaotic attack upon Aurelandi nobility said to have been orchestrated by the Black Serpents, the Viper emerged openly in the streets of Adwick, and in short order, assassinated the Lord of House Hartford in a melee that ensued. While the heiress and now Lady Loretta Hartford narrowly escaped death at the hands of the Viper and his serpents, this outburst of violence would then prompt the Crown to react accordingly, and despite the desperate need for men and strong sword arms for the impending Imperial siege, a large contingent of soldiers, mercenaries, and any able body was dispatched to the purported lair of the serpents within the sewers of Adwick to finally root out the Viper for good. While fewer men exited from those sewers than embarked into the depths, it was clear that the cost to rid Adwick of the serpents had been paid, and the gang's control on the city was shattered forever, or at least for what little time remained before the Imperial siege. Just as sure as the sun rising on that fateful morning of late summer 8324, the Imperial siege began proper, with cannons, cavalry, and cacophonous roar of over 100,000 who comprised one full Imperial legion proper. While Adwick had prepared ahead of time with palisades and fortifications, it became rapidly clear that no matter what might happen, that the city would never resist the siege forever. Despite repelling several brazen assaults by Imperial troops in the first few early days, eyes began to warily turn to the crown for the predictable order of surrender. For at this point, all within the walls knew that the city was nearly surrounded, and retreat was no longer an option, but all but the smallest bands of furtive refugees skulking away in the night from Imperial outriders. Yet on the fourth morning of that fateful siege, just after the early hours of dawn and before the day's cannon fire might surely begin once again, there came a lull. And not any lull such as those seen before the commencement of a battle, but instead, it was one felt by all present from the lowliest peasant to the most stoic of soldiers. On that fateful, overcast summer morning of AT 324, in a wrenching lurch, time itself shuddered to a crawl, but for a scarce moment, and no cracking of the veil sounded forth, but instead, a sickening, oozing, and primal fear crept into the very bones of every single man and beast within Adwick, and all points east to the border. It was said at that moment beneath Adwick, every hole, crack, and crevice that had formed beneath the city over the centuries widened, and from these cracks issued forth a tide of abominations unlike that which has ever been recorded in history prior. Survivors who have fled Adwick since claim these creatures bore the form of large rat men, some no larger than a hobbit, yet others still rivaling the size of any troll. Some say they bore implements of wicked and malign make, serrated blades slathered in poison, yet others would claim they bore nothing more but vestigial claws like the rats they so resembled. Rumors since those days have diverged wildly, although some claims are more consistent than others. Foremost, those few common folk foolish or just unlucky enough to have been east of Adwick on that day claim that from the very soil itself arose a miasma of sorts that might choke the life from anything it touched. It was from this miasma that the rat beasts poured forth, and in the wake of such chaos, all Imperial forces that had hence been occupying parts of Ireland sounded the general retreat and streamed back across the Imperial border. Additionally, despite any claims to the contrary, for all intents and purposes, the defenders of Adwick had indeed made history. For on that summer day of 8324 marked the first time in recorded history that an entire Imperial legion had ever been so soundly defeated in the field. While many have argued that it was not solely due to the defenders of Adwick, and the actual number of Imperial dead has never been reckoned, it was nonetheless true that the events of the war that had transpired up to that point had been instrumental in increasing the cost of the war high enough that the Emperor himself was finally remiss at the losses incurred. Scholars state that he thus withdrew his men to avoid further loss of life, and perhaps worse, further loss of face among his people. It stands true to this day that no known Imperial expedition has been made into what is now known as Eastern Ireland. This is not without good reason, as little word has reached Alzera from that part of the world since. Rumors as told by the few brave travelers daring to get near the boundary of Eastern Ireland claim to have seen the same such rat folk as those who were said to have emerged from beneath the soil on the day the Empire was routed from the country. Oddly enough, however, in the parts of Western Ireland that still stand, the story is quite simple and commonly told that the results of the War of Imperial Aggression were the product of an attempt by the Empire to destroy Ireland with magical weapons, and it was only due to the Empire's hubris in attempting to harness such strange and forbidden powers on an unprecedented scale that caused the weapon to backfire on the same such Imperial legion that was to deliver it against Adwick itself. To that end, A rallying cry has gone up from Cadwell Keep in the years following the war, calling for unity against the Empire, even reaching unto Hayloft, Vernfalder, and Gradia. It's safe to say that while the diplomatic ties between what remains of Arn are yet undetermined, in the wake of such strange events, both commoners and nobility alike have flocked to the churches of the Blue Flame in numbers unlike ever seen before the war. While the paladin orders of Mithrax were left severely undermanned due to their heroic sacrifices during the war, in just the scant years since, the ranks of the church were flooded with new followers and those seeking answers in a world of strange new threats. Now led by Archbishop Helena Varain, scores of acolytes train daily under her watchful and exacting gaze. But what of the king, one might wonder? What of the seat of his kingdom? What of the capital? Well, it was said on that final fateful day of the Summer War of 83-24, atop the tallest tower of Adwick stood a lone man with blonde hair and a regal cape billowing in the wind, who watched over the entirety of the Imperial retreat before he himself joined the resistance against the horrors that beset Adwick. It's rumored that he remains within Adwick to this day, urgently directing the defense of the city under eternal siege. For even though the Empire retreated, Adwick's struggle against the rat folk had only just begun. And despite the passage of 2 years since, to this day, it is only by the vigilance and perseverance of those who reinforce the city and those who remain within that Adwick still stands and the city still survives. Well, I think that about does it.
Oh, your lordship. We got on pretty good with that rhyming thing, eh?
Hi, lad. But it is a little tiresome. After all, once you get going, everyone expects you to keep going.
I know. Takes a lot of coordination, that.
It can't really be done at the drop of a hat.
Bard, will the story ever name those who were involved?
One day, Voxel. When the riddle is solved. The names of the folks are spared from this rhyme. May the truth of history persist throughout time.